Hello, this is Head to Head on UATV, and I am Olis Gerjuk. Today we focus on a topic which is extremely vital for the nation's existence: social identification and national identity. How are these terms being scored by Ukrainians, and how has the outlook of Ukrainians been evolving since 1991, when we got independent from the Soviet Union? The answers to such questions could stay blurred up until now if not an 21-year-old survey done by two researchers, Oksana Malanchuk, Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of Michigan, in cooperation with Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak. Today we are lucky to discuss the topic with Ms. Malanchuk. She is here with us in the studio. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, despite the fact that our nation has been existing for many centuries, our country itself is very young, almost 27 years old, occurring in this August. But what was the situation with our national identification back in 1991, when Ukraine got its independence after 72 years of Soviet occupation?
Well, my survey covers just Lviv and Donetsk for the most part, and we started in 1994. And at that time, Lviv had a strong Ukrainian identity, and Donetsk not so. And what has changed since then? Not much. So the results that we have is that Ukrainians have become more Ukrainian, Russians have become more Russian, and the Ukrainians in Donetsk a little bit more Ukrainian, but not much.
But not much now.
Yes. By nationality, they now say they are many more Ukrainians in Donetsk say they are by nationality Ukrainian, but that's like saying you have a Ukrainian citizenship. But identification as Ukrainian is low. On the other hand, they have dual identity. They have both a Russian identity and a Ukrainian identity, and that's important to them. And when you ask them, when you ask people in Lviv, how do you feel about Ukrainians? Very high. On a scale of 0 to 10, for temperature, 10 is really warm. Lviv Ukrainians are almost 100%. When you ask them about Russians, they go from 6 to 3.5 in 2015. But when you ask Donetsk how they feel about Ukrainians, very high, almost 90%. Russians, almost 90%. So they have a dual identity.
Okay. So this is probably because of the history, right?
Yes, it has to do with the history. And Ukrainians and Russians have been assimilated in Donetsk, so there's no reason for them to have, well, it's not no reason, but they don't have a strong Ukrainian identity, but they do have dual identity. So
does this mean that Ukraine's national identity hasn't actually changed since 1991?
Right. Since 1994, we have an increase in Ukrainians in Lviv saying they're more Ukrainian, but it goes like from 80% to 95%. They were already high. But in Donetsk, it goes up a little bit, moderately, and then not so moderate, not so low.
So how would you estimate the pace of this national identity transforming or evolving, if we can say?
So some of the reason I think that this is happening is in Donetsk is because those people who were pro-Ukrainian have moved out since the war. They've moved to Kharkiv and Kyiv and Lviv. And the people who are left are pro-Russian. And although they do have some Ukrainian identity, and they identify as Ukrainian citizens, not all of them, but many of them.
Yeah, but many of them now have to hide their real position about this.
Yes, that's true, they do. But we don't have any data on that.
That's true. What about social identification? Probably many people from among our audience, they would think that this is a less important issue.
Well, when you look at, so we were interested in why Lviv was so high on national identity and Donetsk was not. So we looked at different kinds of identities. And so Lviv is an outlier. It's unique in its really strong Ukrainian identity. And it doesn't have many more than that. It has a citizen identity and a little bit of a city identity. Donetsk is low on everything except for city. City is higher. So they identify as being from Donetsk, that's their identity. And everything else is very similar to what you would find in any other city in Ukraine, which we looked at in 2015. We looked at 6 different cities. And there you found Lviv was very high on national identity, and Kyiv was close. And then Odessa was very high on the city identity, and Donetsk was high on the city identity.
Mm-hmm. But with such a low level of national identity and with this high city identity, how could these 2 revolutions happen? The Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity?
Well, is it about identity, these revolutions?
Well, it's about politics, but
it's about values, and we don't really test those values in our study, so I can't really speak to that question.
But did Euromaidan influence and the Revolution of Dignity? Did these events influence the national identity of
Yes,
Ukrainians?
they did, but it's not pronounced. I mean, it moved steadily upward in Lviv, and it moved a little bit. So you have a peak in 2004, and then it goes down again in 2010, then it goes up again in 2015. Mm-hmm. That's among Ukrainians in Donetsk.
In Donetsk?
Yes.
What about other regions, and what populations are we talking about?
So I don't have data on anybody, long-term data on anybody else. I only have 2015 on 6 cities in Ukraine, and so I don't have over time changes.
Okay, let's talk about 6 cities. What are they?
Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Lviv, and Donetsk. Mm-hmm. Now, if you ask me what their as I mentioned, Kyiv is very much like Lviv. It's not as extreme as Lviv is, but it's very high in its national identity. But Odessa has a high city identity and a low national identity. But Kharkiv and Dnipro have lower national identity, but it's still there.
But still, there was one really phenomenon occasion in Odessa back in 2014. In May 2014, those Odessa clashes happened between Euromaidan activists and pro-Russian demonstrators. Actually, Odessa seemed to be a very passive city in terms of declaring its pro-Ukrainian position, but then it happened that people stood up.
Yes, well, I'm sure every city has their activists, and every city has their people with pride and patriotism for their country.
But how do you think that those clashes were more about national identity or city identity, or more about safety?
I don't know enough about that situation to say what it was about. So I can't really answer that question. So some other things I can tell you. We also look at different groups that people are close to. So we looked at political groups like communists, nationalists, reformers, and Lviv is very high on, not very high, neither Lviv nor Donetsk are high on any of those groups, but Lviv prefers nationalists and doesn't like communists, reformers in the middle. Donetsk is just the opposite. They prefer communists, they hate nationalists, and reformers are in the middle. So that's the political groups. When you look at religious groups, Lviv doesn't discriminate in terms of how they feel about Greek Catholics or Orthodox. But in Donetsk, the people in Donetsk do not like the Greek Catholic Church, and they like the Orthodox Church.
Well, because in Lviv, both the Greek Catholic and Orthodox Church, they do operate very well.
Yeah. So one other thing that's happening is that the people were growing, religious affiliation was growing from 1994 to 2004. Since then, it's been dropping, even among the Greek Catholics. They're becoming less interested in religion and saying that they're not non-believers. But in Donetsk, they're becoming much more religious. And every year that we took a survey, it went down, down, down until they're much lower in 2015 than they were in 1994 as non-believers. And they have increased their participation in the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate.
Mm-hmm. Well, in spite of religion, one of the other factors to unite the nation is language, right? And
Yes.
but surprisingly, for many years and for many Ukrainians, Ukrainian language seemed to be not very prestigious or beautiful,
Right.
and there were even some talks about Russian language to become the second state language in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, before 2014, before the annexation of Crimea and
Mm-hmm.
the conflict in Donbass. How did it change up until now?
So the Ukrainian language, we asked people how often they speak the Ukrainian language to their mother, their father, their children, their colleagues, their shopkeepers, one other one I can't remember at the moment, their friends. And so it's only gone up in Lviv. The number of times they speak, the number of people to whom they speak Ukrainian, but it's gone down in they hardly speak Ukrainian at all in Donetsk, and Russian language usage has gone up somewhat.
Mm-hmm. Well, in general,
let me just say this, that the Ukrainian speaking, if you look at an outcome variable we used, for example, what do you think about relations with Russia? Should be totally independent from them, or should we have a reunion with Russia? And those people who are Ukrainian speakers are pro-independence, and they tend to be from Lviv. But the Ukrainians and the Russian speakers in Lviv tend to be a little bit more towards the center, not as extreme as Ukrainian speakers. And then Ukrainians in Donetsk are closer to them, but they're still not as close to Ukrainian speakers as they are to Russian speakers in the East. So the attitudes are based on region. So the main finding is that region has the biggest impact on how people think. And they also speak Russian, and whether they speak Ukrainian or Russian doesn't matter.
But how does it influence the nation's unity?
So we asked questions about unity, and everybody thinks it's a good idea to keep the territorial integrity intact. And even the people from Donetsk felt that way. They were at least at a 3 on a score from 1 to 5. But now they're becoming less likely to say that. In 2015, they were less likely to say that we should have unity.
East and West do not?
They do not agree.
They do not agree.
They're on opposite sides.
What are your thoughts? What could we do about it?
Well, I haven't given enough thought to reconciliation as to what could happen to have it resolved. As a matter of fact, one of the things I was looking at was how the youth, because everybody says, well, it's the youth. They will be the answer to our question. They will be more like, the youth will be in the West will be more like the youth in the East. And actually, that's not true. So this question that I asked about relations with Russia, the youth, everybody in Donetsk was going towards independence in 2004, and then it started going away from independence in 2010 and 2015. And I looked at youth specifically to see how and they are further apart now in 2015, the youth in Lviv and the youth in Donetsk, than they ever have been. So I don't have an optimistic result to say that they're the answer to the question and that they could move towards reconciliation.
Yeah, not very promising conclusion of our conversation, but thank you so much for these really interesting comments.
Good, thank you.
That was Oksana Malanchuk, Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of Michigan. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.